Welcome to our webinar on Forages for Soil Health. I'm Stacey Domalewski, the Science and Extension Coordinator for the Beef Cattle Research Council, and I'll be your moderator tonight. Our session is going to last for approximately 1 hour, but it could go a little longer depending on the number of questions you've got for us later during the question and answer period. If you're on Twitter, I invite you to tweet along with us tonight using #BeefWebinar. We are recording this session, and I will email out the link to the recording to everyone that is registered in the next couple of days. So if you miss hearing anything tonight and want to watch the webinar again, you can. So of course, for tonight's webinar, you'll be able to hear and see our presenters, but we can't hear or see you. So if you do want to communicate with us, type into the chat window or the question window on your control panel, and we will be able to read your questions from there. If you have a question or comment for me or the presenter tonight, that's the place you can do it as well. And feel free to send your questions in throughout the webinar. We'll answer them all at the end of the hour. If your internet connection is a bit slow tonight, it could help to close other programs that are using the internet, so any external hard drives or anything like that you're using, as well as to close the webcam window. This means you're not going to be able, we're not using the webcam today, so you won't have to worry about that. So with that, let's get started. So here's what we'll be covering tonight, and I will introduce our first speaker of the night, Henry Janzen. He is a soil biochemist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Lethbridge, where his research focuses on the cycles of carbon and nitrogen in agriculture lands, with emphasis on preserving resilience, maintaining productivity, and reducing net greenhouse gas emissions. The underlying aim is to seek ways of managing our lands wisely to ensure they remain healthy over decades despite upcoming stresses. So Henry, you should be able to share your screen there.
Okay.
All right, we can see it.
And my voice is coming through okay?
Yes, it is.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Stacey, and thank you for the privilege of offering a few thoughts this evening on the link between growing forages and soil health. And I want to say at the outset that my comments this evening are intended to be exploratory, perhaps more than explanatory. What I want to do is take you along on a search for understanding. And I admit sometimes my own search may be a little stumbling, a little errant, but my aim here is to elicit conversation, hopefully fruitful conversation that might follow some of the discussions that I present here. Now, when we're thinking about a search for understanding, often it's helpful to take a historical perspective. So let me take you back 100 years or so ago, when farming in much of Canada was still young. They thought a lot about soil fertility then. They worried about soil fertility. William Saunders in 1893 talked about how nothing is more important than the maintenance of the fertility of the soil. And indeed, their worries were justified. They were right to be worried because it wasn't long in many parts of the country, notably in the prairies, where they observed a very heavy destruction of humus material very early on, soon after conversion to cultivated farming. This humus material, which of course is so important from the standpoint of soil fertility. And that led to a crisis in soil fertility. And the solution? Well, they said, we need more perennial crops. Somehow we have to get away from exclusive grain growing and introduce practices that allow for more grasses and clovers if this humus is to be maintained. And they talked hopefully about increasing the number of livestock kept, thereby growing more forages and going in for a system, so-called mixed farming. Now today, again, there's renewed focus on soil fertility, perhaps not so much from a crisis perspective or a calamity perspective, but more from a standpoint of stewardship. But instead of calling it soil fertility now, we call it soil health. And so you see that phrase over and over again in all kinds of places. And this quest for soil health, as I said, driven by a sense of stewardship, remains. And what is the prominent solution offered today? Well, it's not that different from what it was a century ago. Many are saying we need to reintroduce perennial grasses and legumes into the landscape. For example, an article by two prominent ecologists in the New York Times said, above all else, we need an increase in the acreage of perennial plants. And the most immediately practical way of doing this is to go back to crop rotations that include hay and pasture and grazing animals. So that's the question I want to ponder. How then do forages enhance soil health? But before we get to that question, maybe first we need to ask, what exactly is soil health? This term that we bandy about so freely. It's a phrase, I said, used widely in popular discourse, also increasingly used in science. But it's not a scientific term at all. It's really a literary term, a metaphor, in fact. That's what makes it so visceral, so compelling, so potent and powerful and alluring, because it conjures up imagery in our own minds of our own human illness and well-being, which of course is close to our own hearts. But what makes this phrase so evocative, what makes it so powerful, leaves it a little imprecise, ambiguous, nebulous, some would say. And if we cannot say exactly what it is, how do we know when health is being preserved? Lewis Carroll, in Through the Looking Glass, has Humpty say, when I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. So in deference to Humpty, let me offer this potential working draft of a definition for soil health. Let us say, and this definition is based on that of many others, let us say that soil health is the vitality of a soil and sustaining the social and the ecological functions of its enfolding land. Now, there are many things we could say about this rather convoluted verbiage, but at its core is the essence of functionality. It's the idea of functions, which really is at the heart of any definition of health. The condition in which the organism or the entity in question performs its vital functions normally or properly. So when we talk about soil health, it's not so much how the soil is, not so much how it smells or looks or how it feels to the touch, but rather how it behaves, how it performs. It's not a question of composition or constitution, but its dynamic catalysis of life-giving processes. And here's a critical point, I think. The functions that matter, the services that matter, are not those of the soil itself, but rather the functions of the land in which the soil is embedded. Where by land, I mean ecosystem, not just the soil, but the sky above and the water flowing through and the trees beside, all plants, all biota, and all of their myriad of interactions with each other and their setting. And that, of course, also includes people. Someone once asked Hans Jenny what made a soil good. He answered with a question, good for what? Indeed. Let me offer you a quaint example. This is a soil not too far from where I live. Now, by most indices, by most measurements, probably we would say that this soil is of dubious, precarious health. And that's certainly true if you wanted to grow potatoes. But on the other hand, if your highest aim, if your aspiration was to savor or revel in the aesthetic appeal of wildflowers, well then the health of the soil might be perfectly sublime. Always, soil health is context dependent. You cannot assess the health of a soil divorced from its setting without thinking about where it came from. That doesn't mean we don't do analysis. Of course, we analyze the soil. I've been doing that for many years. But always, when we take those analyses, then we filter those, we view those results through the lens of the functions, the services that we expect of that land, and then further through the values that we impose on those various functions, which means that the criteria for soil health will vary from place to place and from time to time. So to summarize, to know if a soil is healthy, we always start with land, not with soil. So for any place, we go there and we look around and we say, who is here? What's expected here? What will nature endorse here? And only then can we say anything about health. Now in farming, of course, the foremost function historically has been producing yield. And that's still the case. Certainly, as we look forward into coming decades where we have to feed billions of people more, producing yield still is the preeminent function of land. But increasingly, we're looking also at other functions, all other services. In fact, I might suggest that that's what distinguishes health from the earlier terms we used. As we've moved historically from talking first about soil fertility and then just talking about soil quality and now to soil health, we've increased the number of functions which come into play. It's not just yield and profit, as important as those are, but we start talking about regulating climate and filtering water and human health and energy and biodiversity and all of these others, all seen collectively, reflecting how our view of land has changed over time. Once we looked at land as a resource. Increasingly now we see it as an ecosystem. And now I think we're on the verge of seeing land as home. The recognition that we all live on the land wherever we may reside. Whether we live on a wheat farm in Saskatchewan or some high-rise tower in Toronto, we are all ultimately dependent on the land. We all live on the land. But now if we start considering all of these functions simultaneously, it gets a little bit complicated. How then do we define health? Which ones of these count and which ones take precedence over others? I think what we need, as we're looking at all of these functions, all of these services provided by land, we need some kind of a unifying perspective. So let me lead you through one idea that's still congealing and still not fully formed. But let me consider with you one partial possibility. And that is to look back at the very basics of land. Let's go back to the sun, which ultimately drives all of the functions, all of the activity, all of the behaviors that unfold on the land. The ultimate use of land, said Daly and Cobb, is to capture solar energy to support life, human and non-human. So if you look at all of these functions, all of these services, all of these benefits of land that we've talked about, all of them, I think, are tied one way or another to the flows of solar energy flowing through the land. Now, photosynthesis, said Smil, remains the most important energy conversion in the biosphere. Photosynthesis is the process which takes carbon out of the atmosphere and imbues that carbon with energy from the sun, and then delivers that energy to the soil and to the entire landscape, driving those processes, producing those functions, before finally returning to the atmosphere, stripped of its energy, back to CO2. And so we have this cycle of carbon circulating over and over again, always collecting energy from the sun, delivering it into the ecosystem, and then reappearing in the atmosphere as CO2. Someone called this long ago the eternal circuit. So we talk a lot about carbon, but really what we're thinking about, perhaps without even saying it directly, we're thinking about energy flow, specifically solar energy flow. And so if you think about what's happening in farming, that's really what we do. We lay out sheets of green, leaves basically, that capture the energy of the sun. Some of that sun's energy then goes to fuel us through our food, whether directly or by animals. Some of it goes to fuel automobiles and industry through biofuels. But this is the part we sometimes forget about. A large fraction of it needs to go back into the ecosystem, back to the soil, back onto the soil as fuel for all of the biota, all the microbes, all of the creatures that drive this biological machinery that is the ecosystem. If we are to conserve biodiversity, if we are to conserve the functioning of this ecosystem, of this land, we need to leave behind enough energy from the sun for all these other biota which are quietly performing functions, sometimes in ways we cannot even yet fully fathom. So to change the analogy, maybe we can think about this as a river of sunlight flowing through the land. And that brings us at last back to this phrase, soil health. From this perspective, a soil is healthy to the extent that it catalyzes and steers efficiently the stream of solar energy pulsing through the ecosystem. That's not a new idea at all. Leopold, a long time ago, talked about how fertility, we would say health, is the ability of the soil to receive, store, and release energy. And here I may show my bias a little bit, but I think at the hub of this eternal circuit is its impeller, what drives it, its catalyst. There sits soil carbon. Because soil carbon is this massive pool of energy that regulates this continuous flow of energy through the soil plant ecosystem. But generally speaking, when you have more soil carbon, you have greater yield potential, higher resilience, more biodiversity, better climate regulation, and all of these other things. And because soil carbon promotes so many of these functions, so many of these services, it stands as the paramount, the preeminent indicator of soil health. So that leads me back to the definition that I had originally proposed of soil health. And having thought a little bit about what soil health means, let me go back to the question now of how forages can enhance soil health as we've defined it here. And let me propose 3 ways whereby perennial forages can enhance or catalyze this river of sunlight, which leads then to better soil health. The first benefit then is to enhance the amount of energy captured. And forages do that in large part by extending the duration of photosynthesis over the season. In other words, the perennial plants are always there to capture the sun's energy whenever conditions permit. Let me take you through a little analogy. We might say that annual crops are a little bit like sprinters. They're very quick off the mark, quick out of the blocks, and reach their maximum photosynthesis very quickly, but then also fade fairly quickly. Perennial plants are a little bit more like the marathoners. Not quite as fast, not quite as flashy, but they persist and endure much longer. So in the long run, they travel much greater distances. That is, they capture more photosynthetic energy. And when you have more photosynthesis, that means that there is more energy available for all these various functions that we've talked about. A second benefit of forages is that they tend to reinvest more of that energy back into the ecosystem. If you consider wheat as an example of an annual crop, these plants are specifically designed by many years of breeding. They're designed to allocate as much energy, as much carbon, as much biomass as possible in the heads, which we then lop off and export to urban centers or across the ocean, leaving only a smaller percentage for return to the ecosystem. Grass, or another perennial, by comparison, still generates a little bit of material for harvest, but the largest share is returned back into the ecosystem, back into soil organic matter, back onto the soil surface to drive all of this material forward. Now, if we look at those two in comparisons, which of them will store more carbon? Clearly, it is going to be the second one. It's going to be the perennial, because much more of that energy that is captured is reinvested back into the ecosystem. So historically, we've seen that over and over again that converting lands to cropland leads to a loss of soil carbon. That is, to a loss of stored energy. We've seen that time and time again. And often we've blamed that on the action of the plow itself. And certainly that's a factor. But much more important, I think, is the fact that we have made a transition from an energy investing system in the perennials to a system designed to export energy. We've gone from a reinvesting system in perennials to an exporting system in annuals, so we should not be surprised in the latter case, where we're exporting as much material as possible, that the storage of carbon, the storage of energy, then declines. And we've seen the converse, that if we then reestablish grasses, we can recapture some of that carbon. And we have a number of long-term experiments that tend to show this if we wait long enough for these differences to emerge. So the second benefit of forages then is the very innate ability of perennials to reinvest what they have captured into the ecosystem to keep it going, because of course perennials are there for the next year as well. They're designed to protect the capital, as Daniel Janzen put it, ensuring an investment in the future, looking toward resilience, towards the sustainability, towards stewardship. A third benefit of forages is that they tend to enhance recycling. As I've already indicated, annual cropping systems tend to be somewhat linear. Inputs at one end, harvest, and then export. So you have a linear flow with a depletion on the left-hand side. When we introduce cattle, or any other animals for that matter, we provide an avenue, we provide a way of returning the harvested material back to the beginning and converting them into inputs. The fact that we've done is mimic nature and bending that linear system, bending those lines back into loops. Schutt, a long time ago, recognized this. He said, in the manure, we have the opportunity of restoring to the soil 8/10 of the plant food taken from it in the crops they consume. So what that means, so for example, in the case of nitrogen, we can use the same nitrogen atom over and over again for multiple cycles of these carbon flows, thereby reducing potentially leakage and potentially reducing the amount of energy, fossil energy, often used for making fertilizer. So there are these three benefits of forages seen from this energy perspective. They tend to increase carbon energy capture, they invest more back into the ecosystem, and they enhance cycling. So we might say that forages form the foundation, what I would call here sun-powered lands, which is really what we're after, and which is really what it's at the basis of what we called soil health. John Bracken was an Ontario farm boy who went on to be the Premier of Manitoba and later a prominent federal politician. But before that, he was a wise agronomist, I think. He talked a lot about permanence, of continuity. Probably today we would call that sustainability. And how do we achieve permanence? He said, we need livestock, because they make use of forages and all the benefits that come from them. So we're slowly learning something about the benefits of forages. But I think a lot of interesting, I'd say fascinating, research questions remain. Let me simply offer a few of them. Now, we could spend a lot of time talking about agronomy and plant breeding and economics and grazing systems and all of those things that I know very little about. So I'm going to leave those, set those aside, except to say, remind ourselves again, that anything we can do to increase yield, in effect, increases carbon capture, which then gives us more energy available to drive all of these functions that we've been talking about. But in thinking about research challenges, let me focus specifically on a soil perspective. And you might expect a scientist to say that, but I think we still have a long way to go in understanding some of the underlying mechanisms and processes. As an example, let me point you to the rhizosphere. The rhizosphere is the area of soil close to the roots. It's the interface between soil and plant and the teeming microbial populations that inhabit that zone. The rhizosphere really is a hotspot where a lot of the action in the soil happens. And we know that there is energy flowing into the rhizosphere from plants through the roots into the soil. So for example, if we grow plants in an atmosphere with labeled C13 CO2, we find that label there soon enough appears also in the soil. In effect, we have an energy pump from sun to plant foliage through roots into the soil. But we really don't know very well how much and how big is that energy flow. And we really don't know the extent to which there are varietal differences and species differences. Can we fine-tune these energy flows for the benefit of soil? And especially, can we do that in perennials, which tend to be a little bit more difficult to study than short-term annuals? And the follow-up question is, who benefits? Which microbial populations, which microbial species in the soil benefit from this influx of energy that's coming down through the roots from the sun? And what functions do they perform? And can we somehow enhance the beneficial functions by the way we manage these crops, specifically these forages in this case? And another related question that really intrigues me is to think about the sharing of energy and nutrients among plants. Our forestry colleagues have shown clearly that trees have the ability to share energy and nutrients via what they call a wood wide web. In effect, underground mycelial strands which connect the roots of one tree to the roots of another tree. And it raises a question. Does this happen also in our agricultural ecosystem? Does this happen especially perhaps among forages? And can we exploit these processes to improve efficiency, improve yield, improve soil health? A second question is to ask, how can we better understand and study the whole system? As Orr puts it, we as scientists have sometimes fragmented the world into bits and pieces called disciplines. We tend to focus on little corners of these ecosystems, the corners that happen to be our areas of expertise. But health, I've said, is really an attribute of land. It's really the interflow, the intermingling, the interaction of all of these pieces streaming together. And solutions and progress in advancing efficiency and advancing soil health are most likely to come not by studying these little pieces, but by studying the interactions. So, for example, a solution to problems we see in soils may well reside in the way we manage animals. And the converse may be true as well. We here at Lethbridge and elsewhere have been trying to estimate overall greenhouse gas emissions from entire farms, looking at farms as ecosystems, using software we call HOLOS. And so, for example, in livestock systems, we tend to focus on methane emissions, and certainly ruminants are important sources of methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas. But sometimes we overlook the fact that cows eat grass, and that this grass is a way of maintaining carbon in the soil, keeping it out of the atmosphere. And the question we want to ask, what is the overall net effect? And how does our management change the net effect, considering also nitrous oxide and a whole system seen together? That's a complex interaction. And invariably, we have to use various models to do that. Now, I use the term model loosely. A model may be some fancy mathematical construct like those that scientists tend to use. But producers also use a model. A model may simply be a picture in the mind that pulls together all of the various fragments and pieces of this ecosystem that are all interwoven. And from that overall picture, derive the best way to manage the land. And to reiterate, soil health emerges best when we see the entire system and manage our lands accordingly. That is still a challenge. A related question is to ask, can we see the entire landscape? Can we look beyond the uniform patches that constitute our fields and paddocks? That's where we scientists like to go, the nice uniform little plots. But can we study also the margins and the wetlands and the fence lines and the hedges and the edges and the so-called idle lands or wastelands, which perform so many functions, important functions, on the landscape, especially as we look to make our agricultural landscapes perform multiple ecosystem services, as we start to look more at landscape mosaics. And I think perennial plants especially have a vital role to play in some of these strategic locations within these complex agricultural landscapes. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that not all of the functions, not all of the services that matter are easily measurable. Not for all of them can we easily put a number to them. Biodiversity, for example. How do we assign a value or a quantity even to biodiversity? Or aesthetic appeal, which is an important function of many landscapes. The question I sometimes pose is, what is the value of the sound of a meadowlark in a bright, crisp June morning? How do we include that in our understanding of functions of landscapes? And I think we remind ourselves that perennial systems often excel in these so-called non-measurables, which, though sometimes overlooked, certainly are important, vitally important as we go forward. One last question, maybe the one that is most vexing but most fascinating, and that is the question of time. How do we include time in our perspective as we think about the role of forages in promoting soil health? Darwin, grandson of the famous Darwin, wrote that some of the things we want to study depend on time itself, and then everything becomes much more difficult. And so it is. We often talk of sustainability, but sustainability can really, by definition, only be seen in hindsight. It can't be predicted in advance. Time is the final judge. Time is the final arbiter, but it renders its verdict a little reluctantly, sometimes slowly, gradually. In fact, ecosystems themselves change slowly, subtly, unpredictably. I've spent a lot of time trying to measure changes in soil carbon. That's not an easy undertaking, especially when landscapes are complex, like the one shown here, where every nook and cranny has soil carbon of different concentration. And we know that the final effects often cannot be confirmed nor verified until you've waited for years, even decades, after you've instituted a management change. Justifiably, and for good reason, funding agencies are not always willing to wait that long. It's much easier to get funding for a 3-year project than, say, for a 30-year project. And sometimes I've wondered if perennial systems may be somewhat handicapped in this regard. It's much easier to see the flashy sprinter than to watch the long, slow travels of the marathoner, to use the previous analogy. Now, in history, scientists then did spend some time giving thought to the slow changes over long time periods. If we go back a century, we find that in 1911, for example, we had a marvelous network of long-term experiments spanning the country, and especially those in the prairies were very deliberately designed as a network with 23 different systems, often replicated at multiple sites. And these were very deliberately designed to be long-time studies, in their words. Said Angus McKay of Indian Head, it will require the evidence of many years before we can accept the results as being final. And so they took very careful notes, as, for example, in these historical plots established at Lethbridge in 1911. This is a page from one of the notebooks that we still have from 1913 for one of the plots. And so we can page through these old notebooks and find, for example, that on April 5th of 1913, they seeded Fife wheat at 75 pounds per acre. And they used 4 horses for 45 minutes to do the job. And even more impressive, they set aside soil samples periodically, dating right back to the beginning. So today we can go back and reanalyze those archived soil samples and follow the traces of time over the years, over the decades, for a time period now more than a century old. And always, these archive samples have new things to tell us. For example, it is now becoming possible with new techniques to go back into these archives as long as 100 years ago and start to extract from them DNA so that we can learn something about who was active in those soils. What populations and how did they change and what functions were they performing and how does management influence these populations? They have more to teach us. Now, I should emphasize that many of the rotations that were established then, more than a century ago, were innovative, I would say even by our standards. And many of them included forages and manure, presumably in a very deliberate attempt to reintroduce or to introduce livestock into these farming systems. So, for example, rotation T was a 10-year course based on alfalfa and included a manure application. Almost all of these have been abandoned. One remains, so-called rotation U at Lethbridge, based on alfalfa under irrigated conditions. Only a small remnant of that vast network remains. And it's tempting to mourn their loss, but that's beside the point. More important, I think, is to ask, what do we bequeath now? What do we start now to outlive us for the benefit of those who are coming after us? Because I think such so-called listening plates are going to be needed, especially now, on this side of some tumultuous changes that are coming our way, that will be introduced into our landscapes. And I think forages, especially, deserve a prominent place in such long-term experiments. Well, by way of closing thoughts, let me offer you just a few musings, which I admit are partly philosophical. We've said that soil health is tied closely to the functions of land. And I think it's fair to say that many of society's aims, many societal aspirations, one way or the other, when you follow them far enough, we will find they are rooted in land. When we look at the litany of global issues facing our world, I would suggest that we cannot easily resolve many of these societal ills and aims without thinking about land as we've defined it. And that means more deliberately including the human dimension in any discussion, in any evaluation of soil health. Increasingly, I think, we're having to look at our lands as social and ecological systems both. Because we recognize that the foremost factor affecting the health of our lands, the health of our soils, is simply human behavior. Not just the behavior of the farmer, but also that of the consumer, who affects ultimately the marketplace, and that of the policymaker, who sets long-term strategies. Now, the irony is, we now have more people using the land, that is, living from it, and fewer thinking about it than ever before, because our population has become increasingly disconnected. So it seems to me that one of our important mandates, all of us, collectively, is to reconnect people to the land that sustains them. And I have suggested elsewhere that our legacy depends not only on the data and technology and practices we develop, but on the images and the narratives that are planted in human minds. The novelist says, in the long run, a people is known not by its statements or its statistics, but by the stories it tells. Maybe they can be hopeful stories. Goodness knows we need more hopeful stories. Stories like those of the forages and how they can improve the health of our soils and make our lands more fruitful, both for us and also for those who will follow us. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thanks for that, Henry. That was a fantastic presentation. So we'll now open it up to questions from our audience. So for our questions tonight, please type your questions into that chat box on the side of your screen. If your control panel has closed over the webinar, you should see an orange arrow near the top. If you click on that orange arrow, it'll expand and you'll be able to use the chat box to type your questions into. And then I will read them out and we'll hear from Henry tonight. So we did have a couple come in during the webinar. So just give me a second here. All right. So one of the first ones here, so you talked about some measuring increases in soil carbon due to different management practices. Can you speak a little bit more on that?
Sure. Measuring soil carbon in principle is very straightforward. I mean, we go out, we take soil cores, and we measure the carbon concentration of those cores through a number of instruments and techniques. The instrumentation and the actual analysis is now quite advanced. The methods are very accurate. What is very difficult for us is to get a representative sample of soil for analysis. That is probably the biggest challenge. For example, when we do the analysis, we might analyze just a small fraction of a gram of soil. And that small fraction of a gram of soil, maybe, for example, 30 milligrams, has to represent an entire field. And that is a difficult. How many cores do you have to take? And how do you ultimately take those large samples and reduce them down to a tiny, tiny amount that represents that whole field? That is the difficult. That's difficulty number one. A second aspect that is difficult is that we're often looking for very small changes in a large pool. For example, we might have in a given soil in the surface layer, let's say 50 tons of carbon per hectare. And we're looking at a change of maybe 0.2 tons of carbon per hectare per year. So you see this change is very, very small relative to the amount that's there, which is why sometimes we have to wait 5 years, 10 years with very careful sampling to detect that change accurately.
All right, thank you. The next question here is more of a policy question, but are you aware of if the energy investing or exporting dynamic, so of perennial forages, does that factor into policy discussions when we're talking about carbon?
Well, there are a lot of policy discussions around carbon, and I mean, we could spend a bit of time talking about the links between energy and carbon, but probably in those discussions you will have gathered that when people talk about carbon footprints, for example, and carbon dynamics. We're really, it's almost like using carbon as a proxy for energy. So there is a lot of discussion in policy circles about carbon, and inevitably that is also tied to energy.
All right, thanks.
I'd be willing to pursue that further if you had a more specific angle to that question.
Okay, so yeah, if the person who's sending that in, or if anybody else has a follow-up, by all means type it in. So are there certain forages that are better for soil health, or certain ones that you would recommend?
I wouldn't be the one to answer that question, except to say that it likely depends a lot on the land in question, especially on things like climate, things like soil type. But there was a lot of discussion early on whether, for example, it was useful to replace the native grasses with introduced grasses. And so that debate is still ongoing, and I wouldn't want to hazard an answer to what the final resolution of that. Certainly there are differences, big differences among plant forage species. For example, in rooting depth. Some tend to maintain their roots near the soil surface. Others tend to go deeper, for example. And so there are large differences, but generally speaking, my suggestion would be that we do, as I indicated earlier, we go to the land unit in question and look around and see what's the climate like, what kind of plant species will thrive under these conditions, and then try to tune the complement of plant species and varieties to the land in question.
Okay. So this next question here, how do we effectively place volumes of manure on the land? It's heavy on soil that does not have good biodiversity and light application on flourishing soil. So I guess that's their question is the solution heavy on soil that doesn't have good biodiversity? Does that make sense, the way I read it?
I think I can talk about that a little bit. Yeah, manure, and we've seen in our own experiments here at Lethbridge, a colleague, Frank Larney, has done lots of research on using manure to restore eroded lands. And manure is remarkable in its capacity to restore even heavily eroded soils. We've done these experiments where he would artificially remove a lot of the topsoil and then apply various amendments. Manure is actually quite amazing in its capacity for that recovery. So yes, the amount of manure clearly would be a function of the initial composition of the soil and the demand for nutrients and carbon and energy that is required to maintain to restore the biodiversity in that soil. I would say that in the long run, what we're really after, though, is to develop some kind of synchrony where the manure that's coming back to the land is more or less in tune with the amount of material that might be taken off of the land. So, for example, you would take off forages and then feed those to the animals, and the manure that is then the product of that animal feeding goes back into the land. So you develop this more or less self-sustaining cycle. So in the long run, that is what you might want to aim for, although of course that's hard to always practice. And certainly if you've got a very depleted landscape, a healthy dose of manure at the outset is helpful.
All right. So this next question is more of a philosophical question, I'm assuming following up your wrap-up. But how do we reconnect people, especially farmers, to the land so that we can have healthy people, healthy lands, and healthy farm profits?
Yeah, that's a really good question. one of the things, well, let me just say that I don't know the answer to the question, but I will talk a little bit about one of the things that I have been trying to do, and that is simply to try to expand the audience for the work that we are doing. In other words, I think many producers, most producers, all producers, I would say, are still very much connected to the land and recognize the beauty and the value and the functional benefits of land. But increasingly, I think what we need to do is tell some of these good news stories to audiences outside of our farming circles, to tell these narratives and show the important ways that good management can enhance stewardship, for example, and all of these functions that we've talked about, to tell those stories to people who may have lost sight of what farming is all about. And I think we have some ways to go on that, and we may need to find some new ways of telling those stories.
All right. So do you know if the assumption used in the sequestration discussion, so I'm assuming this relates back to that policy question we were talking before, does it base sequestration capacity on above ground biomass?
I'm not quite following that question, I'm sorry.
Okay, that's all right. We'll move on here.
I guess in response to that, I can say, I will say this. I'm not sure if this answers the question or not, but I think this is something we sometimes lose sight of, that soil carbon sequestration is very much a function of how much carbon is going in, that the process of removing carbon from the atmosphere goes through plants. It is the plants, and it is photosynthesis in the plants that actually take CO2 out of the atmosphere. And then it is the extent to which we take that plant material, add it to the soil, and preserve it in the soil that then leads to potential soil carbon gains. That's the process, and I think we need to follow that entire flow from atmosphere through plants, driven by the sun, then into the soil, and then keeping it there as much as possible. So soil carbon sequestration, in principle, really isn't that complicated. Any change in soil carbon is a function of two things. It's basically a reflection of how much carbon you're putting in plant material, and how much is going out largely by decay. By decay, I mean the conversion of soil organic matter, decay of soil organic matter by microbes back to atmospheric CO2. So it's those two processes, the inputs as plant material, the outputs as decay. If you increase inputs more than you increase the rate of decay, you're going to have an increase in soil carbon. But the other way around, you have a depletion, a loss of soil carbon. It's like a bank account. If you want to make your bank account larger, you either have to put more money in, or you have to slow the rate of expenditure. So many of the practices that we talk about do one or the other. And so, for example, the argument that I've made is that forages tend to put more carbon into the soil. In other words, they tend to invest more material into the soil, so the size of the pool, if nothing else, is prevented from declining, and hopefully, in some cases, it also increases.
Okay. So we'll go a couple more questions here. What are your thoughts on using a gene-centric modeling approach for the prediction of greenhouse gases?
Could you repeat that phrase? I'm not sure I recognize it.
So, gene-centric modeling approach for greenhouse gases. Is that something you're familiar with, or?
I'm sorry, that phrase doesn't ring a bell with me. Sorry.
No problem. So what is the correlation between organic matter and carbon in soil?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Sometimes we use those terms interchangeably, organic matter and carbon. Basically, organic matter is all of the plant-derived material in the soil. So it's everything from last year's straw to material that's been sitting in the soil for a long, long time period, essentially the material that gives you the dark color of your topsoil. So that's organic matter. Carbon represents a large proportion of that, typically somewhere like between roughly in the order of 58% of organic matter is carbon. So we can use the terms more or less interchangeably, but except when we report carbon or organic matter, the values will change, the number will change. But if you have higher organic matter, by definition, carbon goes up as well.
Okay. So do you have any insight toward the benefits of multi-species cropping compared to strictly one forage or even forage underseeded with a cash crop?
Well, certainly there's a lot of interest in multiple varieties or multiple species. I'm not a plant ecologist, so I'm not going to offer a specific answer, but certainly it makes sense. Generally speaking, in nature, diversity tends to enhance resilience, and diversification is probably something that we want to aim for.
Okay. So I have a couple questions in here about numbers for carbon sequestration. So they're asking essentially, people are asking about, do you have data about the amount of soil carbon sequestered for either annual crop versus perennial or forages with livestock versus other systems?
We do have some long-term experiments, which, for example, might compare a strictly cereal rotation or a fallow cereal rotation with systems that have some manure or systems that have some forages, or even some that are strictly grasses. And generally speaking, if you take a soil that has been cultivated for a long time, say in a fallow wheat system, and then restore a grass vegetation, then we can see quite significant increases in soil carbon again. Generally speaking, in theory at least, we would assume that if we take a soil that has been cultivated for a long time, and then we restore the grassland vegetation on that soil, we might get close to the original soil carbon content that was there under the native prairie, if of course we're willing to wait long enough.
All right, so I'm going to wrap it up with one final question and kind of summarize a couple questions that are coming in here. But essentially, what is your argument for those who claim livestock emissions are the biggest factor in pollution, and how do you tell that other side of the story?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. We could spend a long time on that question, but let me just give a very summary comment, and that is to say that we need to look, as I've suggested before, at the whole system. We can't just look at just the methane emissions from cows alone and say, well, look at those emissions. We've got to look at the whole system, including the cattle. Yes, we acknowledge that there are methane emissions from ruminants, but then we look also at the benefits that grasslands bring. And we look at the benefits from, for example, the wise use of manure and how it can reduce the amount of imported fertilizer that is needed to sustain productivity. And then when we look at the whole system, then suddenly the picture changes quite significantly in many of these landscapes. So that is the answer I would propose, is to think ecologically. That is to think about the whole system and look at all of these functions we've talked about for the entire ecosystem, and then start to weigh the balances. And very often when we look at it that way, then the picture is not quite as black and white as some would make it out to be.
All right. Well, thanks for the, Henry. We're going to end questions here, but I just have a couple more things to let you know before we go. So the first is how to stay connected with ourselves, or Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, as they were the co-hosts for tonight's webinar. So you can go to either of our websites, which will both be provided in the follow-up email I will send out, as well as if you have a Twitter, YouTube, or Facebook account, you can connect with us there as well. Also, our last webinar for the season is coming up here next month. It'll be on getting the most out of your corn silage, which will be March 28th, so be sure to join us for that. So very shortly, as soon as the webinar ends, you'll be asked to complete a short survey that asks about tonight's session and what you found most interesting for future webinar topics. We really need your feedback, especially as it comes to the end of the year here, as I'm planning for next year already. So if you can provide way with topics that will be both useful and meaningful to you on your operation, it really helps us for planning future webinars. As I mentioned, you're going to be receiving an email from me within the next couple of days with a link to watch the recording of this webinar, as well as some supplemental information on soil health. So that's it. I want to thank all of you at home for joining us tonight. And on behalf of everyone, thank you very much, Henry, for volunteering your time and expertise tonight. Good night.
It's a pleasure. Thanks.